Midnight was approaching. Long after the others had fallen asleep, I found myself tossing and turning in my futon. Instead, I gazed up at the glow of the constellations above my head, hoping that the night would pass on. Just then, I heard a rustling sound near me, sensing that someone had awoken. I feigned being asleep, and I soundlessly turned to lie on my side to see who it was. It was Saito-san. I need water. Ah, the sun is in my eyes. Ah. He was being careful to sneak out quietly, and without making a peep, he exited where we were sleeping. Where could he be going? Perhaps a sullen place where he could stare longingly at the moonlight, safe in the shelter of the night? As he left the camp, I noticed his sunken, lonesome expression, so I silently followed closely behind him, hoping to get a peek into his plan. I found Saito-san alone just as I did back in Kofu, and his eyes were fixed on the pattern of sconces shining throughout the patchwork of the night sky. Blah, 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 blah. Saito-san. I timidly called out to him, and he waited a second before turning to look over his shoulder. His words were surprisingly not as thorny as I'd expected. Perhaps he was still occupied with unpacking all that Hijikata-san had told us earlier, which felt like a shadow ominously looming in our hearts. I had a feeling you'd say that. May I stay beside you? Saito-san didn't answer. Instead, he continued to stare at the sky. If I knew Saito-san, his reluctance to speak hadn't indicated an opposition to what I had asked. I stepped onto the grass, watching my steps through the darkness to stand beside Saito-san. The only sounds around us were the chirp of insects humming in our ear, scattered throughout the forest. Saito-san's voice just barely hovered above a murmur. I nearly confused it with a cicada chirp. Long? It seemed Saito-san was speaking to himself, rather than asking me what I had thought about the situation. Well, this question demanded a thoughtful answer, and honestly I questioned whether or not such an answer existed. Even for Saito-san, who was known for his deliberation, articulated observations, to have been left to wonder. I did my best to offer my perspective. I think the only one who could answer that question and admit to any wrongdoing would be Sun-san himself. And maybe it wasn't only one moment of weakness, or an isolated incident. Perhaps without realizing it, it was the result of many mistakes that Sun-san made in his search for purpose throughout all of this chaos. Maybe at some point, while making all of these mistakes, he realized things would never be the same. Saito-san watched me intently, listening to my answer without speaking. Eventually, his eyes fell to the ground.
俺もいずれはああなってしまうということか。
What do you mean?
地に来る正気をなくし、長年共に戦った仲間を裏切ることに良心の呵責すら覚えなくなる。正しいと信じ続けていたものをなくし、信じていた自分をも忘れてしまう。そんな日がいつか来る。
All of the pain Saito-san was feeling came into clear focus. Sanan-san, our friend, whom we saw that day. For Saito-san, who struggled to come to terms with living with his affliction, maybe Sanan-san appeared like a crystal ball, offering a sinister glimpse into his future. I don't think you'd end up like that. Just because the two of you drank the water of life does not mean that you are destined to experience the same fate as him.
何故だ。
Saito-san's expression was full of doubt, something that was so unlike him. Because you are strong, Saito-san. No matter what choice you are confronted with, I don't expect you to ever make the wrong one. I almost saw a smile curl in the corner of his lips, but his shoulders remained tense and guarded.
俺は強くはない。本当に強ければ鬼と戦うために落ち水など飲む必要はなかった。
Strength doesn't just come from your ability to fight in battle.
では一体何だというのだ。
Well, this question came defensively, and I was thrown off a little by how much his delivery stung. Instead of answering, I retorted with my own question. Let me ask you something. Why is it that you keep your sword on the right side of your hips, Saito-san?
左利きだからと前に言ったはずだが。
There are plenty of people who are left-handed in the world. But for swordsmen, most of them try and adapt with using their right hand, don't they? You said so yourself. No matter which dojo you attend, they would immediately attempt to correct you to use your right. What is it that made you keep going? That made you refuse to change? Saito-san had not anticipated me to turn the line of questioning back onto himself. His eyes widened. It appears I struck a nerve with him, and after an awkward pause, he finally answered.
直す必要がなかった。俺は右差しでも十分強い。それなのに。 何故わざわざ左差しにして剣の腕前を落とさなければならぬのかがわからなかった。
See? That just shows how strong you are, Saito-san.
何？
Because you kept with your resolve. You made a decision and you stuck by it, and you fought for it despite all of the naysayers. And I think that could have been easy for anyone to deal with. You ask yourself if the same fate will happen to you as it happened to Sanan-san. But I think you already know the answer. Only you can decide what is right for yourself. And with that attitude, it can only lead to good things. At least, that's what I think. Saito-san gazed at me stoically, gazing with puppy-like eyes and a docile expression. Whether or not my words resonated with him, or if they were completely worthless for all he cared, was unknown to me.
そんなことを言われたのは初めてだ。
He spoke flatly, and he once again looked towards the smattering of stars glittering across the sky. Why smattering? Smattering is a weird word. A gorgeous and serene sight indeed. And we're on to chapter 4. After the staged imperial ambush out in Nagarayama, the Shinsengumi was scattered with the wind. The days of planning and acting as a collective group seemed to be long behind us. Without a knowledge of what paths our comrades and allies were heeding. All we could do was adapt, one day at a time, left to tend our fates against the unknown. Despite these circumstances, Saito-san heroically led the remaining men to Aizu. According to scout reports, the troops who had fought against the Shinsengumi in Kofu were now marching to the northeast to subjugate whatever resistance remained. Supposedly, it was the Aizu who were currently engaging against the tide of incoming imperial soldiers. Nagakura and Harada, sadly, had never returned to the Shinsengumi after their hasty departure. However, rumors of their activity, including the formation of their own unit, which was headed for Aizu, the Shogi company, greatly aroused my attention. It was under such pretenses, clinging onto whatever normalcy we could reclaim, that we had arrived in Aizu. It's August 1868. One could hardly believe it was July, as cool, blustery winds flowed from down the mountain ranges overhead. A summer in Aizu proved far more temperate than any I had expected in either Edo or Kyo. Our march to the city was met with the bright chirping of bugs and insects along the well-traveled paths. For us, our arrival followed an arduous but hopeful journey, and a reunion that took months in the making.
久しぶりだな。悪いな、追いつくのが遅れちまって。
Oh great, the scene that broke my heart originally. Here we go.
合流する前に新政府軍の奴らに全滅させられちまってたらどうしようって思ってたんだけど。
I need my water.
はじめくんがそんなヘマするわけないよな。
Hijikata-san, Heisuke, I'm so glad to see that you are both safe. My emotions got the better of me, and I wept flowing tears that glistened atop my smiling cheeks.
副長が戻ってきてくだされば100人力です。
そうそう、新選組の鬼副長って新政府軍の間でも恐れられてるみたいですから、俺たちの力で新政府の奴らに目に物を見せてやりましょうよ。
お前らも相変わらずみてえだな。
Saito-san, on the other hand.
副長、その足は。
Until Saito-san mentioned it, I hadn't noticed that Hijikata-san was dragging his left leg as he walked.
これか。宇都宮の戦でやられちまってな。痛みは大したことねえが、さすがに戦場を駆けずり回るのは無理だな。じれったくてしょうがねえぜ。
Even though he was dealt a less than thrilling hand, I hadn't seen such an enthusiastic, positive response from Hijikata-san in a while, and he was smiling no less.
サイト、お前大使を連れてあちこちで戦ってくれたんだ。 噂は俺たちんとこにも届いてたぜ。
いえ、最前線だった白樺城はすでに敵の手に落ちました。城を奪い返すこともかなわず、じりじりと後退を続けている状態です。今の前線もどこまで支えきれるか。
Saito-san solemnly delivered his report detailing the challenges he'd face, but Hijikata-san looked at him kindly.
よくやってくれてるよ。
Something peculiar raised my attention. In the past, Hijikata-san had acted on a policy of sternness and discipline, making him a lot harder to approach. Now, however, his demeanor was far more relaxed and sympathetic. A far cry from the commander under whom I had served. I wondered to myself if during our separation he had experienced a change of heart, one that challenged him to open himself up to those he had cherished most. As I ruminated upon this thought, Saito-san then asked the question about which all of us had been worrying.
副長、近藤局長は。
Hijikata-san fell silent. He let out a heavy sigh, and his gaze dropped timidly to face his feet. His answer, unexpectedly, was short.
助けられなかった。
Somewhere in our hearts, we had all anticipated this answer, but having it expressed so directly. There was nothing to stop our hearts from sinking, for each following breath to be drawn into our lungs was like pulling tar from the cracked, dark earth.
最後はやはり切腹で。
Hijikata-san shook his head.
切腹じゃねえ。首切りだ。
Beheaded? Although both seppuku and beheading were public forms of execution, what they meant were different entirely. Ancient legends used to say that a human soul was stored inside their abdomen. So by committing seppuku and slicing open your chest cavity, it meant cutting into the place where your soul took refuge. No easy feat indeed. Compare this to the act of beheading, where your neck is effortlessly struck with a thick, sharp blade. A death, I imagined, that was painless compared to seppuku. Seppuku was a statement, and by confronting death in such a manner, a warrior's honor was preserved. It was the embodiment of chivalry in one last act. However, there is no honor in being beheaded. There are no appeals or vestiges of respect. There is only silence until the blade is fallen.
近藤さんは腹を詰めさせてくれって言ってたんだが、新政府のやつらがもともと。
As Hijikata-san recounted Kondou-san's fate, he started to choke up as he spoke, struggling to articulate the visceral image as he conjured it in his mind. He took a deep breath, and through gritted teeth, we heard what became of our chief.
もともとは百姓のせがれだったくせに、武士の真似事をして腹を切りてえなんて、少子千万だって、そう言いやがった。
Never before had I seen Hijikata-san so vexed, so disturbed. Saito-san, however, took all of this in without speaking, and he stared plaintively at the floor. After a pause, he lifted his head and spoke.
お気持ちお察しします。局長もさぞ無念だったことでしょう。
Hijikata-san turned up to look at Saito-san. Through moist, tear-soaked eyes, he shot a bitter glance at Saito-san that made my hair stand.
無念なんかじゃねえよ。
Hijikata-san's aggressive response surprised all of us, but Saito-san's eyes grew wide in astonishment. He could only stare back at the visibly shaken Hijikata-san, questioning what he could have meant.
新政府のやつらは斬首だって伝えた時、近藤さんが泣きわめいて証言漏らして必死に命乞いするとでも思ってやがったんだろうが、あの人は首切りだって言われた時もな、みっともなく逃げ回ったり取り乱したりなんてしなかったってよ。いつものあの笑顔で、そうか、しょうがないなって言ったのはそれだけだったらしい。ただこのままメイドに行ったら閻魔さんがびっくりするから、武将髭だけ剃ってくれって言ったんだとよ。これ以上潔い死に方なんてあるか。生まれは百姓でも最後に腹を詰めさせてもらえなくても、誰が何と言おうとあの人は本物の武士だったぜ。もう死んじまおうって状況に置かれてあの人と同じことを言える人間がどれだけいるってんだ。
Saito-san fell silent. Hijikata-san's words fell heavily on the ears of everyone in the room, and they were speechless. They rang so true to what we had been feeling, but couldn't say. Just then,
伝令です。会津藩はこれから白川城奪回のため出陣するそうです。
わかった。それでは我らも共に。
just as Saito-san looked over to his men to give the command, a voice stopped him.
いや、俺たちは行かねえ。このまま仙台へ向かう。
All it took was Hijikata-san's order for Saito to freeze.
どういうことですか、副長。
旧幕府軍の軍議で決まったんだ。新選組は仙台に向かい、東北諸藩と共に戦うってな。
つまり会津を見捨てると。
俺だってできれば最後まで会津と一緒に戦いてえさ。だが俺たちに仙台へ行けっていうのは会津側の意志でもあるんだよ。
In other words, it seemed that the Aizu's plot to strike the castle was a decoy for the Shinsengumi to escape and support the northeast safely. If that was the wish of Lieutenant General Matsudaria, then perhaps the Shinsengumi had no choice but to follow these orders.
松平中将様のご意向はよくわかりました。ですが俺はこたびの命にだけは従うことができません。
サイト。
Hijikata-san shot Saito-san a stern look, like an instructor staring down upon his student. But this did nothing to faze Saito-san, who merely gazed back at him coldly.
我々新選組は会津藩に多大なるご恩顧を被っています。会津藩がなければ今の新選組はなかったはず。新選組という名も会津公より賜ったものです。その会津がまだここで新政府軍と戦っている。我々が武士として会津公に備中を尽くす気は今を置いて他にないと考えます。
Saito-san's words were so decisive that Hijikata-san stood in shock. I couldn't blame him. Never once had Saito-san ever stated his opinion with such force and purpose to Hijikata-san.
俺や片森公の命に背いてもお前はここに残るっつうんだな。
はい。 軌跡を失い武士としては死んでいた俺を生き返らせてくれたのは新選組、ひいては会津公です。新選組、そして会津藩は俺の中では武士そのものなんです。ここで会津を見捨ててしまえば俺は武士としての生を全うすることなど到底叶いません。
なるほど、お前が言いたいことはよくわかった。だがいいのか、薩長、特に長州の奴らは会津藩を親の敵以上に憎んでやがる。もしかすると幕府そのものよりも嫌ってんじゃねえかってくらいにな。必要以上の兵力で攻め込んできやがるだろうし、戦死した後死体をゴミみてえに扱われるかもしれね
え。覚悟の上です。
Saito-san's willingness elicited a worse smirk from Hijikata-san.
つまり俺たちの道はここで別れちまうってことだな。
申し訳ありません。
おいおい、別に謝ることじゃねえだろう。お前が自分の頭で考えて決めたことにケチをつける気はねえよ。しかしお前がこんなに喋るやつだとは思わなかったな。知られざる新たな一面ってやつか。
Hijikata-san let out a hearty chuckle, but Saito-san continued staring at the ground. Or perhaps he couldn't bring himself to look up.
土方さん、俺が初めて司令官に行った時のことを覚えてますか？
A wide grin curled from Hijikata-san's lips as he showed earnestness to respond, eagerness to respond.
忘れろって言われたって忘れられねえよ。司令官には市内なんて置いてねえ。表木刀しかねえってのに本気で打ち込みやがって。最初にお前の相手をしたのが宗司じゃなかったら骨の5、6本は折れてたはずだぜ。下手すりゃ死人が出てたかもな。宗司も宗司でお前を殺す勢いで木刀を叩き込もうとしやがるし、俺たちが途中で止めてなきゃ確実にどっちかが死んでたな。
There was a bright glimmer of nostalgia coming from Hijikata-san's eyes as he reminisced about Shie Hall. Kondou-san, Hijikata-san, Sanam-san, Okita, Nakakura, Harada, and Heisuke. The place where all of the Shinsengumi men had spent their youth. And for Saito-san, it was a home of refuge in which he could forge both his identity and his technique. A place to call home.
試合を終えた後、卑怯者、邪道、無作法者と言われなかったのはあの時が初めてでした。
真剣で切り合う時に卑怯もクソも言ってられねえからな。そんなことくっちゃべってる間に切られちまう。それに右差しは反則でも何でもねえだろう。お前の立場で考えりゃ周りの連中全員が反則してるみてえなもんだろうしな。
Coming from Hijikata-san, those words must have been the greatest gift Saito-san could have ever received.
あの時俺はこう思いました。あんたや近藤さんの命令なら尊攘派の大物志士でも大名でも偉人でもどんな人間でも切り殺すことができると。
実際お前には汚れ仕事ばっかりさせてきちまったよな。悪かったな。
Saito-san shook his head curtly in response to Hijikata-san's apology.
それを受け入れて実行したのは俺の意志です。俺は自分で命令に従うことを選びました。 そしてそれをこれから先もずっと続けていくつもりでした。ですが
なあサイト、俺たちから離れることをそこまで申し訳なく思うことねえんだぜ。お前はお前の意志で主君を、お前の生き方を選んだ。ただそれだけのことだ。お前が選んだ道は間違ってねえよ。
Saito-san looked to be fighting back tears. He suddenly dug his teeth into his lips, trying to hold back the deluge of emotions that was waiting to burst. And even so, he spoke with a restrained monotone. Perhaps if he hadn't done so, his voice would be a little more than a blubbering mess of emotions. So in typical fashion, Saito-san was attempting to remain taciturn in the face of duty. After a moment, Ujikata-san turned to Shimada.
島田、お前はどうするつもりなんだ？
俺はもちろん土方さんと共に参ります。せっかくここまで来たんですから、どこまでもお付き合いしますよ。
What about you, Heisuke? Are you leaving with Hijikata-san as well?
まあ俺は一度死んじまったようなもんだからさ。あの時一旦死んで生き返ってまで何をしたかったのかを今までずっと考えてたんだけど。
Heisuke stopped himself. Did you think of an answer?
そうだな。
Heisuke scratched his nose absent-mindedly before timidly assuming a reflective tone.
もし俺があのまま羅刹にならずに死んでたとしたら、きっと最後の瞬間こう思ってたんじゃねえかな。せっかくだからみんなで作った新選組がどうなるのかを最後まで見届けたかったって。
おい平助、最後までっつうのはどういう意味だ？
You know what he meant!
新選組がもうすぐなくなっちまうみてえじゃねえか。縁起でもねえな。
Hijikata-san glared at Heisuke, but then he stuck out his tongue playfully.
それに今の土方さんって背中がガラ空きだからさ、誰かがついててやらねえとな。
What about you guys? Soma? Nomura?
俺たちも副長にお供します。
そうそう、こうなったら地の果てまで追いかけてやるぜ。
I see. This whole time, I've been walking alongside the men of the Shinsengumi. But now our paths were splintering, and it seems each of us has a destiny to fulfill. I suppose I'd be lying if I said that I wouldn't miss them, but like Hijikata-san said, their path is their own.
雪村、お前はどうするつもりなんだ？
Hijikata-san had mentioned that this place would soon become a battlefield, fraught with death and danger. If I were to remain here, I likely would stand no chance. However, the same choice fell on Saito-san's shoulders. If either of us choose a different path, it was likely that the two of us would never see each other again. Well, we're staying here. I will stay here. My answer came to everyone's surprise. The individual who seemed most stupefied was Saito-san, whose expression was still aimed towards the ground in a fit to suppress his emotions. Although the words hadn't come from his mouth. His brows told the entire story, furrowed with so much curiosity as to why I answered how I did.
さっきの俺たちの話聞いてたよな。あいつはこれから激戦地になる。ここに残ればひでえ死に方をするのは目に見えてる。それでも残りてえって。
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared. But the thought of living my life away from Saito-san, scattered somewhere else while he fought here, I couldn't think of another option.
理由は聞かねえ方がいいのかな。
As Hijikata-san expressed his resignation, he glanced over at Saito-san. In turn, Saito-san's gaze was fixed on me, staring at me with the same stoic blue eyes I'd always admired.
二人でゆっくり話し合って決めろよ。無理なようだったら、後から俺たちを追っかけてきてもいいんだしな。
With that, Hijikata-san kindly patted my shoulder with his hand. Then he turned around and began sauntering down the mountain path alongside Shimada, Heisuke, Soma, and Nomura.